Thank you for staying. That's good. It's legal, isn't it? We've got a stand, and we've got a construction team thing here. Chris is here, and so is Joe. We've also been dishing out pens, but they haven't been so successful as all the freebies you can get. It's amazing. Conference, this time you've exceeded yourself with all the freebies, so thanks very much. If you want a bag to put them in, then we have a Mitchell Moore's bag that you can put them in as well, if you like, so that's fine. I'm going to talk about the guide, but before I start, I'd just like to say, if you get an email from Andrew Carpenter at 2 o'clock in the morning that says, Alan, I've got a great idea, then my advice is to switch the phone off for at least 6 months, because Andrew's great idea was to produce a legal guide for off-site manufacturing. And that's what we have been tasked to do. What we did, we got a group of Southwest construction lawyers together, and we produced this guide, and it's got various topics and subjects which looks at off-site manufacturing and how the construction industry has to change. Of course, other Southwest law firms are available, but these firms kind of stepped up to the plate and has put these articles together. So I'd like to, if you don't mind, just highlight a couple of topics within the guide, if that's okay. What I want to talk about very quickly is the forms of contract which we could use for off-site manufacturing, ownership and security and payment of monies, and then finally off-site, on-site pop-ups. So that's what I want to talk about. There are other topics within the guide. There's health and safety, there's the RIBA overlay, and we also look at the NEC form of contract. So there's other things in there as well, but I just thought I'd give you these 3 topics just to have a look at, if you don't mind. So on the subject of forms of contract, what we want to do is, and what's been talked about already, we're not doing anything new. The construction industry knows what to do. We just might have to do it differently for off-site manufacturing. So there's nothing sparklingly new in this guide. It just allows us, though, to think, right, what should we do when we're dealing with off-site? And this is the scenarios that we've kind of painted. So the first one is the client wishes to procure a building. The preferred solution is off-site. The method to be adopted is modular. And the modular building is pre-designed and assembly starts upon commitment and payment. And the principal contractor is appointed after the modular building is ordered. And there's 2 aspects to that. Firstly, the design aspect. The construction industry, as you know, we like to design as we go along. Even though JCT says everything's designed from the outset, we have something called an information release schedule. And so design seems to be, in the traditional construction process, a kind of continuing process. Yeah, that's the way we build normally. Whereas, of course, if you're doing off-site, an off-site manufacturer will not start their machines until they've hit that design freeze date, until it's been fully designed. So we've got to think about that. Secondly, payment. The construction industry has a huge reputation for not paying. And it only will pay something if it can actually see it on site and it's nailed down to the site. And once that's done, then we pay within the next 90 days or whatever. And that's the traditional construction industry. The manufacturing industry, of course, they won't start a machine until they've received a very large sum of money up front. Yeah. So again, we've got a divergency between the manufacturing sector and the construction sector. So we've got to start thinking about how can we deal with this on a contractual way. So the first question is the answer a design and build contract, JCT, with a nice letter of intent? Well, let's hope not. It should never be the answer anyway, but let's hope it's not the answer to this one. So let's ask another question. How should the industry respond to need to design to be completed before the work starts on site? And then the next question is, should the principal contractor, the main contractor, be liable for a fully designed, off-site manufactured product? That is a big question, because surely a main contractor is going to receive an off-site product, which it probably was never involved in. It was pre-designed, pre-manufactured, had no input whatsoever, and yet certain clients require that main contractor to take the risk of defects on that. And I think it's worth us thinking about that as an industry. The industry is starting to look at that. We have the new insurance BOPAS scheme, which is starting to warrant building products for a certain period of time. And so we are getting third-party insurance companies that are starting to warrant products before they come on site. And so I think there's an argument that maybe a main contractor should not be responsible for something that's been designed probably 5 years in advance and constructed off-site. And if we do ask for the main contractor to be responsible, you're probably paying a premium for it. So we have to look at that. Should we be looking at different construction contract arrangements? And then on the supply contracts, should we be using a standard supply contract to engage the manufacturer? Yeah. And the reason I say that is because what comes across our desk are loads of different types of terms and conditions from off-site manufacturers, where there are all different caps and liabilities, all different terms and conditions. And perhaps we should respond by perhaps having a standard supply contract, and maybe one of the industry sector representative bodies should have a look at that. So that might be something to do next year. So a couple of suggestions for contracts. We've talked about early contractual engagement. JCT produces a pre-construction agreement. That's a good agreement to use. You can pay the contractor if you're using that way up front, and they can order materials. NEC has X22, but that tends to be just for design. So there are ways of getting monies paid to a contractor to the supply chain before you actually start on work. Another one worth thinking about is construction management. So this is the technique, and of course a lot of sophisticated clients are now looking at this. This is the idea where you have separate trade contracts. You do not have one main contractor being ultimately responsible. You have a separate trade contract. So if you're putting in a road, you have a contract for the road. If you're putting in the foundations, you'll do that. So different trade contracts. And of course, in the development world, they do that all the time if you're a Barratt and that type of thing. So worth having a look at that. Something that is kind of gone off the board, but I think it's worth having a look and reminding ourselves of a JCT intermediate form of contract with named subcontractors. I had a look at this, and this is, you probably all know this yourself, but it's worth reminding ourselves. What happens under a named subcontractor arrangement? The client invites tenders for the off-site works. The tender states the terms of the main contract and lists the attendances that will be provided. The subcontractor and client enter into a named subcontract and employer agreement, and that agreement allows the client to pay for and develop a design for the fabrication of that. Yep. So you're engaging that manufacturer before you've even got a main contractor on site. And another interesting aspect of it is that the design responsibility stays with that named subcontractor. We're not asking the main contractor to take design responsibility. So I think it's worth having a look at that, or at least adapting it. But there is a model there which we could use for off-site manufacturing. I want to slightly change the subject now about supply contracts. I've already mentioned, should we be having a standard supply contract for off-site manufacturers? And Ian Griffiths of BPE talks about in the guide about the NEC for forms of contract, and the NEC does publish a supply contract. So should the industry be adopting a standard supply contract where you can state under X25 the various warranties that you want? The only thing that you probably need to put in is a testing regime. So you go to the factory and test before it gets delivered. But I think it's worth looking at that. So we've talked about supply contracts there. I now want to slightly change the subject about ownership and security of payment. Do you remember I was saying that we pay up front for these materials. Now, I know that there are some national contractors that say, actually, we cover the cost of that. But generally speaking, most manufacturers need some money up front. So the question is, how does somebody who's paid that money make sure that it stays their money or they're getting the materials that they've paid for? And we've looked at that in a couple of articles. The first option is to actually just look at the terms and conditions. You think to yourself, right, I'm buying these materials, why don't I just look at the terms and conditions in the contract? Does it allow for advance payment? My only concern about that is if you look at the Sale of Goods Act, there's a couple of presumptions. And that is, firstly, ownership transfers on payment. And to prove ownership, you need to identify the goods and materials. Yeah? You just can't have a stack of timber and say, half of that is mine. Yeah? And once ownership is taken, you also take the risk as well. So if you are using a Sale of Goods Act type environment, then you really would want to think about changing those, because if you're paying money, you want the ownership, but you don't want the risk. Yeah. So if you're looking just at your supply of goods contracts, then there's something to look at there, I think, that you need to probably change. Option 2 is a vesting certificate. This probably overrides those terms and conditions. It basically says, look, I've paid you a lump of money. I think these amount of kind of goods are mine. Yeah? So you vest those goods, you take ownership of them. Again, it's subject to, of course, identifying those goods. But it is a good way of doing it. People do use it, but it does have its pitfalls. You have to talk about the insurance arrangements, which would have to be in joint names to make sure that if anything does go, if the goods are damaged while they're still in storage, you'd want joint names insurance. So a vesting certificate is something which people do use, but it does have its shortfalls. I just want to skip over that slide. The third option is an advanced payment bond. So this does not look at ownership of materials. This basically says, I've paid £1 million to this manufacturer. I've not received my goods. Dear bondsman, please pay me my £1 million. Yeah, you're buying an insurance product. That's basically what it is. So the insurers are not interested in who owned the materials or anything. It is just merely, if you don't get what you paid for, the insurers will respond. It is available in the market. There are particular people out there who are now marketing themselves as bondsmen who will give you this product. So it's not looking at ownership, it's just a lump of money which is being underwritten. And there's some advantage in there. Of course, there's some costs being set up. You pay a premium because it's an insurance product, but and you probably get about 90% of what you've paid out. Yeah, so worth looking at that. So I've talked about contracts, and I've talked about advance payment, and now I want to talk about pop-ups, which I think is something we kind of just invented as a name, really. What is a pop-up? It's not a calendar shop just before Christmas. It's a temporary factory which you put on site where you can manufacture whatever you want on site. So it's an off-site facility, but on your site. So if you've got a development that's going to last 10 years, then why not put up a temporary factory? And it saves, of course, a lot of transport costs. Of course, it doesn't have to be on the site. It could be slightly off the site somewhere else. But the idea is that you are building that factory just for that particular project. If it's on site, there's a couple of questions to ask. They're the advantages of it, which I've just talked about. One of the other advantages are health and safety. You're building these houses in a controlled environment. It's bound to be better for people's health and safety. Yeah. So it's a factory on site. So 2 questions. Do you need planning permission? and do you need a lease and license? Planning permission. The reason why you go onto a building site and you see porta cabins stacked on top of each other and a temporary road is because of this order. And this order says you're allowed a provision on land of buildings, movable structures, works, plant or machinery required temporarily in connection with and for the duration of operation being or to be carried out on, in, under or over the land or on the land adjoining that land. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but basically you can put your site office on the site. Yeah, that's basically what it allows. Now, the question is, do pop-ups fall under the GDPO order? And the answer to that question is you have to ask your local planning authority, because only they will tell you whether they like what they see or not. If, whilst it is up to the local planning authority, the courts have given some guidance. The courts will look at how permanent and how substantial this factory is. The courts have held that if it's going to stand up for about 2 or 3 years, then that's substantial. It's not that temporary. Yeah. The permanence of it, if you start digging holes in ground and filling it up with concrete and putting a steel structure up, that's not particularly temporary. That's pretty permanent, really, isn't it? So the courts have kind of given the councils that kind of guidance. So our view is the best thing you should do if you're thinking about doing this is going to ask the local planning authority and ask for a lawful development certificate. And within 8 weeks, they should give you an answer, yes or no, whether you're allowed to do it. So the point being is, if you're thinking about doing something up front like this, pop-ups, you've got to get up early and speak to the local planning authority. Finally, on pop-ups, should you have a separate lease or license for a pop-up? Well, I think the answer is yes. What you're doing is building a temporary factory on your site. Yeah, that's what you're doing. So the building contract cannot control that factory. Obviously a building contract allows you to come on site, but it doesn't control a factory that we're talking about here. So it needs to think about the working hours. Is this factory allowed to build other goods for other sites? Yeah, hours of work, noise, all these types of things. So if you're thinking about a factory either on or adjacent to the site, these are the types of things you need to think about. So unfortunately, I don't think you can just put up a 50,000 square foot factory right next to your development without either planning permission or some kind of license or lease. Well done. So you've done the law bit. I hope that's interesting. We've put these guides all around. Please take them with you. And of course, if there's any items which you want to discuss, then any of the authors would be pleased to discuss. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alan. Not always easy to get across the legal perspective, but we did find within Constructing Excellence that one of the obstacles to this move towards more offsite or use of offsite was a lack of knowledge. So it's a gap that needed filling. So thank you. Our final speaker